It's the year 1419, and Europe is drowning in chaos. The 100 Years' War is tearing France apart, kingdoms are collapsing, and in the middle of this medieval nightmare, a 23-year-old man receives news that will change his life forever. His father has been murdered. Philip the Good didn't choose to become Duke of Burgundy. Destiny thrust it upon him in the most brutal way possible. His father, John the Fearless, was assassinated on a bridge in Paris during what was supposed to be a peace meeting. Imagine young Philip receiving that news, knowing that his father's killer was likely someone they had trusted, someone who had looked his father in the eye and shaken his hand before driving a blade into his heart. But here's where Philip's story gets fascinating. Instead of immediately seeking revenge like any hot-headed young noble might do, he did something unexpected. He waited. He observed. He learned. This wasn't weakness, it was the birth of one of medieval Europe's most cunning political minds. You see, Philip inherited more than just a title that day. He inherited a duchy that was caught between two massive powers, France and England. Burgundy was like a prize caught between two hungry wolves, and everyone expected this young duke to pick a side quickly. But Philip had different plans. The first thing he did was something that would define his entire reign. He learned to play both sides. While publicly maintaining his oath of loyalty to the French crown, he secretly opened negotiations with the English. This wasn't betrayal in his mind. It was survival. He understood something that many rulers of his time didn't. In a world where kingdoms could crumble overnight, flexibility was more valuable than rigid loyalty. Here's what makes Philip's story so compelling. He turned his greatest weakness into his greatest strength. Being caught between France and England could have destroyed Burgundy, but Philip used that position to become the broker, the deal-maker, the man both sides needed. He became indispensable, and the results? Within just a few years of taking power, Philip had transformed Burgundy from a vulnerable duchy into one of the wealthiest and most influential states in Europe. His court became a magnet for artists, scholars, and merchants from across the continent. He founded the Order of the Golden Fleece, one of the most prestigious chivalric orders in medieval history, and turned Burgundy into a cultural powerhouse that rivaled Paris and London. But here's the question that haunted Philip throughout his reign, and it's the same question we need to ask ourselves. When you're playing a game where everyone else is playing for keeps, where do you draw the line between smart politics and outright betrayal? Philip would spend the next 48 years of his life walking that razor's edge, building an empire that would outlast him and earning a nickname that still puzzles historians today. Was he really the good? Or was that just the most brilliant piece of medieval branding in history? The answer might surprise you because Philip's story is about to get a lot more complicated. Let me tell you about a moment that shaped European history, a moment that happened on a cold September day in 1419 on the Montereau Bridge near Paris. Picture this scene. Two of the most powerful men in France meeting for what everyone believed would be peace talks. One was the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII of France. The other was John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy and one of the most feared men in medieval Europe. John the Fearless wasn't called fearless because he was reckless, quite the opposite. He had earned that name through decades of calculated political moves and strategic alliances that had made Burgundy incredibly powerful. But on that bridge, his political instincts failed him for the first and last time. Within minutes of the meeting beginning, John lay dead, struck down by the Dauphin's men in what was supposed to be a sacred truce. Now here's where the story gets deeply personal. Back in Burgundy, 23-year-old Philip was going about his day when a messenger arrived with news that would change everything. His father, the man who had taught him everything about power and politics, was dead. Not fallen in battle like a warrior, but murdered during peace negotiations like a common criminal. Imagine being Philip in that moment. You're young. You've just inherited one of the most complex political situations in medieval Europe, and your father's blood is crying out for vengeance. The medieval code of honor demanded that Philip seek immediate revenge against the Dauphin. Every noble in his court expected it. Every ally of his father was watching to see what kind of man this young duke would prove to be. But here's what makes Philip's story so fascinating. He didn't do what everyone expected. Yes, he knelt beside his father's body and swore an oath of vengeance. But what happened next reveals the political genius that would define his entire reign. Instead of rushing into war against France, Philip did something that shocked everyone. He started secretly negotiating with the English. Think about how scandalous this was. Philip was technically a vassal of the French crown. His family had sworn oaths of loyalty to French kings for generations. The proper thing to do was to work within the French system, maybe demand justice through the courts, or challenge the Dauphin to single combat. But Philip looked at the situation and saw something different. He realized that his father's murder had actually given him something incredibly valuable, a legitimate reason to break with France without looking like a traitor. The French had broken the sacred trust first by killing his father during a truce. Now Philip could align himself with whoever offered Burgundy the best deal, and at that moment, that someone was England. The English were thrilled. Here was one of France's most powerful dukes offering to switch sides in the 100 Years' War. They promised Philip everything he wanted: recognition of Burgundy's independence, favorable trade agreements, and most importantly, acknowledgement that he was an equal partner, not just another French vassal. But here's the brilliant part. Philip never completely burned his bridges with France either. Even while negotiating with England, he kept diplomatic channels open with various French factions. He understood something that many medieval rulers missed. In a world where alliances could shift overnight, the smart play was to keep your options open. This created an incredible tension that would define Philip's entire 48-year reign. He was simultaneously seeking revenge for his father's murder, while building an empire that would eventually dwarf both England and France in wealth and cultural influence. He was honoring his family's blood while betraying his family's traditional loyalties. The question that haunted Philip, and the question that still fascinates historians today, is this: was he a son seeking justice for his murdered father, or was he an ambitious ruler using his father's death as an excuse to build his own empire? The answer, like everything about Philip the Good, is far more complex than it first appears. Love makes the world go round, they say, but in Philip the Good's case, love made the world's money flow straight into Burgundy's treasury. Let me tell you about one of the most strategically brilliant marriages in medieval history, a union that didn't just join two people but literally rewrote the economic map of 15th century Europe. Philip married 3 times during his life, and each marriage was carefully calculated to strengthen Burgundy's position. But it was his third marriage, to Isabella of Portugal in 1430, that transformed everything. Now, you might wonder why a Duke of Burgundy would look all the way to Portugal for a wife when there were plenty of eligible princesses much closer to home. The answer reveals just how far ahead Philip was thinking. Portugal in the 1430s wasn't just another small kingdom on the edge of Europe. It was rapidly becoming the gateway to the world's riches. Portuguese explorers were pushing down the African coast, establishing trading posts, and most importantly, they were beginning to control the flow of gold, spices, and exotic goods that Europe craved. When Philip married Isabella, he wasn't just getting a wife. He was getting access to Portuguese trade networks that stretched from Lisbon to Morocco and beyond. But here's where Philip's genius really shows. Through his marriage to Isabella, he gained something even more valuable than access to Portuguese gold. He gained control over the sea routes that connected northern Europe to the Mediterranean. Suddenly, merchants who wanted to trade between England, the Low Countries, and the Mediterranean had to go through Burgundian territory and pay Burgundian taxes. Picture this: a merchant in London wants to sell wool to buyers in Venice. Before Philip's marriage, that merchant had several route options. After Philip's marriage, the safest, most reliable route went straight through Burgundy, and Philip made sure to tax every transaction, every cargo shipment, every business deal that passed through his lands. The results were staggering. Within a decade of his marriage to Isabella, Philip had become wealthier than most kings in Europe. His court became famous for its luxury. And here's a fact that might blow your mind. Philip owned a collection of tapestries that was worth more than the annual income of entire kingdoms. These weren't just decorations. They were portable wealth, investments that could be moved, sold, or used as diplomatic gifts. But here's where the story takes a darker turn, because all this wealth came with a price that Philip's subjects had to pay. While the Duke and his nobles lived in unprecedented luxury, the common people of Burgundy were being taxed to the breaking point. Philip needed constant revenue to maintain his lavish court, fund his diplomatic missions, and pay for the armies that protected his expanding territories. Imagine being a peasant farmer in Burgundy during this time. You're working the same land your grandfather worked, but now you're paying taxes not just to your local lord, but to the Duke for his trade routes, to support his diplomatic missions, and to fund the elaborate ceremonies that kept foreign ambassadors impressed. The irony was bitter. The very success that made Burgundy powerful was built on the backs of people who would never see a fraction of that wealth. Philip's court records show that tax collection became so aggressive that entire villages were sometimes forced to sell their livestock just to meet their obligations. While the Duke was commissioning masterpieces from Jan van Eyck and hosting banquets that lasted for days, his tax collectors were seizing farm tools from families who couldn't pay their dues. This creates a fascinating moral question that echoes through history right up to today. Can a leader be called good if their policies create incredible wealth and cultural achievements, but also cause real suffering for ordinary people? Philip genuinely believed he was doing what was best for Burgundy. His economic policies did make the duchy stronger and more influential. His patronage of the arts created cultural treasures that we still admire today. But at what cost? The wealth that flowed through Burgundian trade routes created jobs and opportunities for merchants and craftsmen, but it also created a system where the rich got incredibly rich while the poor struggled to survive. Sound familiar? Philip the Good had essentially created one of medieval Europe's first examples of what we might recognize today as extreme wealth inequality. His marriage to Isabella didn't just change Burgundy's fortunes. It created a template for how political marriages could be used to control international trade and concentrate wealth in the hands of the few. The question that haunted Philip's reign, and the question we still wrestle with today, is whether the ends justified the means. Was the cultural and economic flowering of Burgundy worth the price paid by ordinary people who had no voice in these grand political calculations? Here's what makes Philip the Good such a fascinating historical figure. He was a man of extraordinary contradictions, someone who could commission breathtaking works of art in the morning and order the execution of rebels in the afternoon. To really understand Philip, you need to see both sides of this complex ruler, because they're both equally true and equally important to his story. Let's start with the side of Philip that earned him the nickname, the Good. In 1430, he founded the Order of the Golden Fleece, one of the most prestigious chivalric orders in European history. This wasn't just some medieval social club. It was Philip's attempt to create a new standard of nobility, a brotherhood of knights bound by the highest ideals of Christian chivalry. The members wore golden fleece pendants as symbols of their commitment to honor, justice, and protection of the innocent. Philip genuinely believed in these ideals. He spent enormous amounts of money patronizing artists like Jan van Eyck, who created some of the most beautiful paintings in Western art under Philip's sponsorship. He established libraries, supported scholars, and turned the Burgundian court into one of Europe's great centers of learning and culture. When you walked through Philip's palaces, you were surrounded by beauty that was meant to inspire and uplift the human spirit. But here's where Philip's story gets complicated, because this same man who championed the highest ideals of chivalry was absolutely ruthless when it came to maintaining his power. When peasants in his territories revolted against crushing tax burdens, Philip didn't show them the mercy that his chivalric ideals demanded. Instead, he sent in his armies with orders to crush the rebellions completely. The contrast is stark and uncomfortable. Philip would spend his mornings discussing philosophy and theology with scholars, admiring paintings that celebrated Christian virtues like compassion and forgiveness. Then he would spend his afternoons planning military campaigns that would leave entire villages in ruins and hundreds of peasants dead. One of the most revealing moments of Philip's reign came in 1435 at the Treaty of Arras. Remember, Philip had been allied with England for 16 years, ever since his father's murder. The English had supported him, traded with him, and treated him as an equal partner. But by 1435, Philip realized that continuing his alliance with England was no longer in Burgundy's best interests. So what did he do? He secretly negotiated with the French and completely abandoned his English allies. The English were stunned. They had trusted Philip, considered him a reliable partner, and suddenly found themselves diplomatically isolated. Philip didn't just switch sides. He helped France and England make peace in a way that left England much weaker than before. Now, you could argue that this was just smart politics. Philip saw which way the wind was blowing and adjusted his sails accordingly. But think about it from the English perspective. They had honored their agreements with Philip for 16 years, and he betrayed them the moment it became convenient. Where was the honor and loyalty that the Order of the Golden Fleece was supposed to represent? This is what makes Philip such a complex figure. He wasn't a cartoon villain who was cruel for the sake of being cruel. He genuinely believed in justice and honor and beauty. But he also believed that his first duty was to Burgundy, and if that meant breaking promises or crushing rebellions or betraying allies, then that's what he would do. Here's a specific example that shows this contradiction perfectly. In 1438, a group of peasants in Flanders rebelled against new taxes that Philip had imposed to fund his court expenses. These weren't violent revolutionaries. They were farmers and craftsmen who simply couldn't afford to pay anymore. They sent delegations to Philip asking for mercy, explaining that their families were starving. Philip's response reveals everything about his character. He listened to their pleas with apparent sympathy. He spoke about his responsibility to care for all his subjects. He even quoted scripture about the duty of rulers to protect the weak. And then he ordered his armies to march into Flanders and put down the rebellion with overwhelming force. The peasants were no match for professional soldiers. The rebellion was crushed within weeks, and Philip made sure that the survivors understood the consequences of defying their duke. Villages that had supported the rebellion were heavily fined. Leaders were executed as examples to others. And Philip returned to his court to continue patronizing artists and theologians, apparently seeing no contradiction between his actions and his ideals. This is the fundamental tension in Philip the Good's character. He was a man who genuinely loved beauty, justice, and honor in the abstract, but who was willing to commit acts of real cruelty to protect his power and his vision of what Burgundy should be. He wasn't a hypocrite exactly, because he truly believed in his ideals. But he had convinced himself that sometimes you had to do terrible things in service of greater good. The question that haunted Philip's contemporaries, and the question that still challenges us today, is whether this kind of moral compromise is inevitable in leadership, or whether it represents a fundamental failure of character. Can someone be truly good if they're willing to betray allies and crush the weak when it serves their purposes? Philip spent his entire life trying to balance these contradictions, and the tension between his ideals and his actions shaped every major decision of his 48-year reign. Picture the most extravagant party you've ever heard of, then multiply it by 100, and you might begin to approach the sheer spectacle that Philip the Good unleashed on Europe in 1454. The Feast of the Pheasant wasn't just a banquet. It was a 3-day explosion of medieval excess that left witnesses speechless and historians still trying to figure out what Philip was really up to. Let me set the scene for you. It's February 1454, and Philip has invited every important noble in Western Europe to his palace in Lille. The guests arrive expecting a typical court feast, but what they find when they enter the Great Hall defies imagination. The centerpiece of the entire event is a live pheasant, not just any pheasant, but one dressed in jewels worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. This bird is wearing a golden collar encrusted with rubies and pearls, standing on a pedestal in the center of the hall, like some kind of bizarre medieval idol. But that's just the beginning. The walls are covered with tapestries depicting the recent fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire, showing Christian knights being defeated by Turkish warriors. Mechanical birds fill the hall with artificial birdsong. There are fountains flowing with wine instead of water. And everywhere you look, there are performers dressed as exotic animals, mythical creatures, and historical figures. The food itself was beyond anything medieval Europe had ever seen. We're talking about dishes that took weeks to prepare. Whole roasted peacocks reassembled with their feathers, swans stuffed with other birds, pies so large they required multiple servants to carry them. One chronicler counted over 40 different courses served during the main banquet alone. But here's where the story gets really interesting, because all this excess wasn't just about showing off Philip's wealth. There was a deeper political game being played, and the live pheasant was the key to understanding it. You see, 1453 had been a catastrophic year for Christianity. Constantinople, the great Christian city that had stood for over 1,000 years, had finally fallen to the Ottoman Empire. The news had shocked all of Europe. The Turks were now threatening to push further into European territory, and Christian rulers were supposedly united in their determination to launch a new crusade to reclaim the Holy Land. Philip positioned his feast as a response to this crisis. After 3 days of unprecedented luxury and entertainment, he stood before his guests and made a dramatic announcement. He was taking a sacred vow, he declared, to lead a crusade against the Ottoman Empire. And not just any vow. He was swearing this oath on the live pheasant, which he claimed represented the nobility and courage of Christian knighthood. The moment was carefully choreographed for maximum emotional impact. Philip spoke passionately about the suffering of Christians under Ottoman rule. He talked about the duty of Christian knights to protect the innocent and defend the faith. And one by one, his guests stood up and made similar vows, swearing on that jeweled pheasant that they too would join this holy crusade. The hall erupted in cheers. Chronicles describe grown men weeping with emotion as they pledged their lives and fortunes to this sacred cause. It was, by all accounts, one of the most moving displays of Christian unity and determination in medieval history. So what happened next? Absolutely nothing. That's right. Despite all the dramatic vows and emotional speeches, Philip never launched his crusade. In fact, he never even seriously began planning one. The Feast of the Pheasant became famous throughout Europe, but the crusade it was supposed to launch existed only in the imagination. This raises a fascinating question. Was Philip genuinely moved by religious fervor when he organized this feast? Or was the whole thing an elaborate piece of political theater? The more you look at the evidence, the more complex the answer becomes. On one hand, Philip did seem genuinely concerned about the Ottoman threat. His correspondence from this period shows real worry about Turkish expansion into Europe. He had also spent his entire reign positioning himself as a champion of Christian values through the Order of the Golden Fleece and his patronage of religious art. But on the other hand, the timing of the feast was suspiciously convenient for Philip's other political goals. By positioning himself as the leader of a potential crusade, he was asserting his status as one of Europe's most important rulers. Kings and emperors who might otherwise have ignored the Duke of Burgundy suddenly had to take him seriously as a potential military ally. The feast also served as an incredible display of Burgundian wealth and power. Every guest went home with stories about Philip's extraordinary resources and organizational capabilities. In an age when military alliances often depended on perceptions of strength, the Feast of the Pheasant was like a medieval arms demonstration. Perhaps most importantly, the feast allowed Philip to avoid making any immediate commitments while still appearing to be a strong Christian leader. By making his crusade vow conditional on support from other rulers, he could blame them when the expedition never materialized. It was brilliant political maneuvering disguised as religious devotion. The Feast of the Pheasant reveals something essential about Philip the Good's character. He understood that in medieval politics, perception was often more important than reality. He knew that a single spectacular event could shape his reputation for decades, and he was willing to spend enormous amounts of money to create that impression. But it also raises uncomfortable questions about the gap between Philip's public image and his private motivations. Was he a devout Christian leader genuinely concerned about the fate of Christianity? Or was he a calculating politician using religious rhetoric to advance his own agenda? The answer, like so much about Philip the Good, is probably both and neither at the same time. The jeweled pheasant became a symbol of medieval excess, but it was also a symbol of the complex relationship between power, faith, and spectacle in the 15th century. Philip had created an event so memorable that people are still talking about it 500 years later, but whether that makes him a great leader or a great showman remains an open question. On June 15, 1467, one of medieval Europe's most powerful rulers drew his final breath. Philip the Good had ruled Burgundy for 48 years, longer than most kings ever dreamed of holding power. He had transformed a collection of feudal territories into one of the wealthiest and most culturally sophisticated states in Europe. He had patronized the greatest artists of his age, founded one of the most prestigious chivalric orders in history, and accumulated riches that made other monarchs envious. But as Philip lay dying in his palace, surrounded by the treasures he had spent a lifetime collecting, a troubling question hung in the air. If he had truly been such a great ruler, why was he leaving behind an empire that was already showing cracks in its foundation? The man who inherited this glittering but fragile legacy was Philip's son, Charles. History would remember him as Charles the Bold, though the rash might have been more accurate. Where Philip had been patient and calculating, Charles was impulsive and aggressive. Where Philip had built alliances through careful diplomacy and strategic marriages, Charles preferred the direct approach of military conquest. Here's what makes this succession so fascinating. Charles inherited all of his father's wealth and power, but none of his father's political wisdom. Within just 10 years of Philip's death, Charles would be dead on a battlefield, and the mighty Burgundian State would be torn apart by France and the Holy Roman Empire. It was one of the most dramatic collapses in medieval history, and it raises some uncomfortable questions about Philip's legacy. Let's look at what Philip actually left behind. On paper, it was impressive. Territories stretching from the North Sea to the Alps, trade networks that connected England to Italy, and a treasury that could fund armies larger than most nations could field. The Burgundian court was still the envy of Europe, attracting artists, scholars, and diplomats from across the continent. But beneath this glittering surface, there were serious problems that Philip had never fully addressed. The first was the fundamental weakness of Burgundy's political structure. Unlike France or England, which were unified kingdoms with clear lines of succession and authority, Burgundy was essentially a collection of different territories held together by personal loyalty to the Duke. Philip had been skilled enough to manage these competing interests, but he had never created institutions strong enough to survive without his personal involvement. Think about it this way. Philip had spent 48 years being the indispensable man at the center of every important decision. He personally negotiated treaties, personally managed relationships with local nobles, and personally balanced the competing demands of different regions within his territories. This worked brilliantly, as long as Philip was alive and capable, but it meant that when he died, there was no one else who understood how all the pieces fit together. The second problem was financial. Yes, Philip had accumulated enormous wealth, but he had also created a system that required constant expansion to remain profitable. The lavish court, the extensive diplomatic network, the professional armies. All of this cost money, and the only way to keep paying for it was to keep increasing taxes or conquering new territories. Philip had been skillful enough to manage this balancing act, but he had essentially created a machine that had to keep growing or it would collapse. Charles inherited this system but lacked his father's ability to make it work. Where Philip had been content to expand gradually and consolidate his gains, Charles was impatient for dramatic conquests. Where Philip had been willing to negotiate and compromise, Charles saw any concession as weakness. The result was a series of increasingly reckless military campaigns that drained the treasury and alienated allies. But here's the really troubling part. Many of the problems that destroyed Charles's reign were actually the inevitable consequences of Philip's policies. The crushing tax burden that had funded Philip's magnificent court finally pushed his subjects to the breaking point. The complex web of alliances that Philip had maintained through personal relationships began to unravel when his son proved incapable of managing them. The very success of Philip's reign had created expectations and obligations that were impossible to sustain. This raises a profound question about leadership and legacy. Is a ruler truly successful if their achievements can't survive their death? Philip had created something magnificent, but it was so dependent on his personal abilities that it began falling apart almost immediately after he was gone. Consider this. Philip called himself the Good, and his contemporaries generally agreed with that assessment. He was seen as a wise, cultured, and effective ruler who had brought prosperity and prestige to his territories. But within a generation of his death, those same territories were being conquered and divided by foreign powers. The artists and scholars who had flourished under his patronage were scattered. The Order of the Golden Fleece, which had been the symbol of Burgundian prestige, became a Habsburg decoration. So what are we to make of Philip's legacy? Was he a great ruler who happened to have an incompetent son? Or was he a skilled politician who created a system that was doomed to fail? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, but it forces us to think more carefully about what we mean when we call someone good. Philip the Good was undoubtedly successful by the standards of his own time. He expanded his territories, increased his wealth, patronized great art, and maintained his independence in a dangerous political environment. But he was also a ruler who prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability, who built a system that could only function under ideal conditions, and who never adequately prepared for the challenges his successors would face. The fall of Burgundy after Philip's death wasn't just the result of Charles's mistakes. It was also the inevitable consequence of the choices Philip had made during his long reign. The empire he built was magnificent, but it was built on foundations that couldn't support its weight once the master architect was gone. Perhaps that's the most honest assessment of Philip the Good. He was a ruler who achieved great things during his lifetime, but whose legacy reveals the limitations of personal brilliance in the face of institutional weakness. He was, in the end, a man of his time who created something beautiful but unsustainable, leaving behind a cautionary tale about the difference between temporary success and lasting achievement. So here we are, at the end of Philip the Good's remarkable story. And I have to ask you, what do you think? Was this man who ruled Burgundy for nearly half a century truly deserving of the title the Good? Or was that just medieval spin doctoring at its finest? Think about everything we've discovered together. Philip was a patron of the arts who commissioned some of the most beautiful paintings in Western civilization. Yet he crushed peasant rebellions without mercy. He founded the Order of the Golden Fleece to promote Christian virtues. Yet he betrayed his English allies the moment it became profitable. He created unprecedented prosperity for his territories. Yet he built that prosperity on a system that collapsed within a generation of his death. Philip the Good was, above all else, a man of contradictions. He genuinely loved beauty, culture, and learning, but he was also ruthlessly pragmatic when it came to maintaining power. He could quote scripture about caring for the poor, while simultaneously imposing taxes that drove those same poor to desperation. He could speak eloquently about honor and loyalty while secretly negotiating with his enemies. But here's what makes Philip's story so relevant to us today. These weren't the contradictions of a hypocrite or a villain. They were the contradictions of someone trying to navigate an impossible situation. Someone who believed he could serve both his ideals and his ambitions without having to choose between them. The question Philip's life poses to us is this: in a world where good intentions often lead to harmful consequences, where noble goals sometimes require terrible methods, what does it actually mean to be a good leader? Is it enough to have the right intentions, or are we judged by our results? Is it possible to be both effective and moral, or does power inevitably corrupt even the best of us? Philip's story suggests that the answer isn't simple. He created genuine beauty and prosperity, but he also caused real suffering. He built something magnificent, but he built it on foundations that couldn't last. He was called the Good by his contemporaries, but history has had to wrestle with the complexity of that legacy ever since. Maybe that's the most important lesson Philip the Good can teach us, that the question of what makes a leader truly good is more complicated than we'd like to admit. It's not enough to look at the monuments they built or the wealth they accumulated. We also have to ask about the price others paid for those achievements. We have to consider not just what they accomplished, but how they accomplished it, and whether those accomplishments could survive their death. Philip the Good lived in a world very different from ours, but the moral questions his life raises are timeless. How do we balance competing loyalties? How do we pursue noble goals in an imperfect world? How do we judge historical figures who achieved great things through questionable means? These are questions that every generation has to answer for itself. In the end, Philip the Good may not have been as straightforwardly good as his nickname suggests, but he was undeniably fascinating. He was a man who tried to have it all: power and virtue, wealth and honor, success and legacy. And his story is a reminder that such ambitions often come with costs that aren't immediately apparent. The Duke of Burgundy, who died in 1467, left behind a legacy that's still being debated more than 500 years later. That might be the most fitting monument to his complex life. Not the tapestries or the paintings or the Golden Fleece, but the questions his story continues to raise about power, morality, and what it truly means to be good. What do you think? Can someone be called good if their success comes at the expense of others? Is it possible to be both an effective leader and a moral person? Philippe the Good's life doesn't give us easy answers, but it does give us a compelling framework for thinking about these enduring questions. The story of Burgundy's greatest duke reminds us that history isn't just about dates and battles and political treaties. It's about human beings trying to navigate impossible choices, and the consequences of those choices echoing through the centuries. Philippe the Good was one of those human beings, and his story continues to challenge us to think more deeply about the nature of leadership, power, and what we really mean when we call someone good.